There are moments in history when money stops meaning anything, when the numbers on a note become as empty as the paper they're printed on. In Germany, in 1923, that moment arrived quietly. It began with prices written in pencil, because by evening, they would need to be changed. It ended with people weighing money instead of counting it. For most of the world, the fall of the German mark is a statistic. Inflation, at a rate so absurd it sounds fictional. For those who lived it, it was not a chart. It was breakfast that cost one price and dinner that cost 10 times more. It was a sound of footsteps at dawn as workers pushed wheelbarrows full of paper to market, hoping to spend their wages before they lost their value by noon. Germany's economy had been wounded long before the collapse. The Great War had left the nation defeated, humiliated, and in debt. The Treaty of Versailles demanded reparations, payments to the victors in gold, coal, and marks. The German government didn't have the gold. It had paper and printing presses. At first, printing seemed harmless. It kept salaries paid, factories running, and promises intact. The logic was simple. Better to have too much money than too little. But the more notes they printed, the less each one meant. By 1922, the mark was already falling. The exchange rate, once 4 marks a dollar, climbed to hundreds, then thousands. By mid-1923, it reached millions, and still, the presses kept running. For ordinary people, life became a daily race against time. Wages were paid twice a day. Shops closed at midday so that employees could rush to the market before prices doubled again. Housewives became accountants, weighing flour against the shrinking value of their cash. The government printed notes so large that children played with them like building blocks. 100,000 marks, 1 million, 1 billion. The zeros multiplied faster than the paper could be printed. Imagine the smell of the ink, the heat of the presses running all night, the trucks carrying bales of banknotes instead of food. The mark had become a joke, but the laughter was hollow. A loaf of bread cost 250 marks in January 1923. By November, it cost 200 billion. The middle class, the teachers, the civil servants, the small shop owners were destroyed. Their savings, built over a lifetime, were erased in weeks. What had once been security became ash. Gold wedding rings were sold for groceries. Family heirlooms were traded for potatoes. There was no safety. Banks that had survived wars and empires were reduced to chaos. The numbers in passbooks grew higher and higher, but they no longer meant anything. To buy coal for the winter, families carried cash in suitcases. When thieves struck, they didn't steal the money. They stole the luggage. And yet, life went on. Children still went to school. Trains still ran. Newspapers still printed headlines, though sometimes on the back of old issues, because paper was too expensive. People adapted because there was no choice. They learned to barter. Farmers exchanged eggs for shoes. Tailors mended coats in return for bread. For a time, the economy existed without money, a society trading memories, skills, and favors instead of currency. Some found ways to survive. Those who held foreign currency, gold, or land could still buy. Others fled, but most stayed, trapped between hope and hunger. The collapse didn't feel like a sudden disaster. It felt like a long, slow theft, the stealing of value itself. And through it all, the printing presses roared. In Berlin, officials worked in shifts, signing bundles of notes until their hands cramped. Factories that once made furniture or machine parts were converted to print money. Some even printed their own, local governments, cities, and companies issuing emergency Nachtgeld or necessity money, decorated with drawings and slogans, as if art could disguise desperation. At night, in the dim light of candles, families counted their bills like prayers. The numbers grew, but the food didn't. A pension that once bought comfort could no longer buy bread. Teachers sold their books. Musicians pawned their instruments. The war had taken bodies. Inflation took dignity. Still, people believed it would end soon, that someone would stop the presses, that the mark would recover, that the nation would find its footing. But belief, like currency, devalues with overuse. By the autumn of 1923, it was clear that nothing could be done. The mark had ceased to function as money. Bartering wasn't a choice anymore. It was survival. In the countryside, farmers refused to sell their crops for paper. Cities starved. Children fainted in schools. Factories closed. The government was collapsing alongside its currency. And yet, amid the ruin, something else was happening. Something invisible but profound. People were changing. They stopped trusting money, banks, and institutions. They trusted only what they could hold, trade, or hide. Value became physical again: bread, coal, clothing, anything tangible. It was not just an economic collapse. It was a psychological one. The people who lived through it never forgot. Even decades later, they would keep savings in gold coins, hide cash in jars, and distrust anything that promised stability. The scars of hyperinflation were deeper than hunger. They rewired how an entire generation thought about security. And this distrust, this national trauma, would have consequences far beyond the 1920s. But for now, imagine it, an entire society where numbers no longer mean anything, where millionaires beg for food, where workers are paid with bales of paper, where children use currency as toys because that's all it's worth. Imagine being there. Waking up each day to find your money had died overnight, and yet the world still demanded you live. If you watched this far, take a moment to reflect. Because stories like this aren't just history. They're warnings. Confidence, not gold, is what gives money its power. And when that confidence dies, everything else follows. Subscribe if you want to understand the next time it happens. By November 1923, Germany had stopped pretending. The mark was dead. No one knew exactly when it had died. Perhaps when bread reached 1 billion marks, or when wages were paid in baskets, or when the government began printing currency on one side only to save ink. What mattered was that money had ceased to function as money. The cities were starving. Coal trains sat idle because no one could pay to move them. Shops stopped accepting cash altogether. Farmers refused to bring their produce to markets, demanding gold, foreign currency, or barter instead. In some villages, church bells were melted down and traded for grain. In Berlin, workers gathered in squares not to protest, but simply to wait for news, for food, for something solid to return. It was in this despair that the German government made one last attempt to resurrect trust. A new chancellor, Gustav Stresemann, turned an economist named Hjalmar Schacht. Their plan was simple in theory, but radical in practice. They would create a new currency, one that could not be printed without limit. On November 15th, 1923, the Rentenmark was born. Unlike the old mark, it wasn't backed by gold. There was no gold left. Instead, it was backed by something even more tangible: the land and industrial assets of Germany itself. One Rentenmark was declared equal to 1 trillion old marks, and almost miraculously, people accepted it. The miracle wasn't mathematical, it was psychological. After years of chaos, the population wanted to believe again. Prices stabilized overnight, not because of the currency's intrinsic value, but because faith returned. Shopkeepers began writing fixed prices again. Farmers came back to market. The printing presses fell silent. The noise of inflation, the endless roar of creation and destruction, stopped. For the first time in years, silence meant peace, but the scars were permanent. The middle class that had once anchored German society was gone. Their savings had vanished, their homes often sold, their sense of security replaced by quiet humiliation. They had followed the rules, saved responsibly, trusted the system, and the system had devoured them. Historians often describe the hyperinflation as an economic crisis. For those who lived it, it was something deeper, a moral one. It destroyed not just wealth, but trust. And once trust is gone, it takes generations to rebuild. In the years that followed, this distrust became part of the German soul. Children who grew up watching their parents' money turn to dust would later become adults who feared inflation more than war. They hoarded, saved, and distrusted anything that promised easy prosperity. The word stability became sacred. But trauma is a dangerous teacher. When the Great Depression struck less than a decade later, the fear of repeating 1923 shaped every decision. The government cut spending instead of printing, raised taxes instead of borrowing, and watched unemployment skyrocket. People preferred deflation to inflation, starvation over chaos. That choice, driven by memory, deepened the crisis and helped destroy the Weimar Republic. The psychological aftermath of the fall of the mark would echo through German politics for decades. It bred cynicism, a quiet, festering anger toward institutions and elites. When new voices rose promising order, discipline, and stability, many listened. They didn't want revolution. They wanted control. It would be unfair to say that inflation alone led to the horrors that came later, but it left the soil ready. It taught a generation that paper promises meant nothing, that value came only from strength, and that when governments fail, power becomes its own currency. Still, amid all that darkness, there were stories of resilience, small acts of survival that defied despair. Families turned gardens into farms. Artists used worthless notes to make collages. Bakers kept accounts and bred loaves instead of money. In some towns, people issued their own handwritten currencies, backed by reputation alone. Communities rediscovered the meaning of cooperation, rebuilding trust where institutions had collapsed. For many, survival wasn't about wealth. It was about dignity, the refusal to give up humanity in a world where everything else had lost value. By the mid-1920s, as the economy stabilized and foreign loans began to flow again, Germany started to rebuild. Factories reopened. Cities lit up. The Rentenmark held. The crisis had passed, but not forgotten. Every coin, every note, every price tag carried the invisible memory of 1923, the year money died. In cafes and universities, economists argued about what had gone wrong. Some blamed the Treaty of Versailles, others the central bank, others still the greed of speculators. But the truth was simpler. When governments create money faster than value, the outcome is not wealth, but illusion. The presses may print hope, but they cannot print trust. The lessons of 1923 would become global. In the decades to come, every nation facing inflation would study Germany's collapse. Argentina, Zimbabwe, Venezuela, all repeating the same logic, all discovering that confidence, once broken, does not return easily. What made the fall of the mark unique wasn't just its scale, but its humanity. It revealed how deeply money is woven into the fabric of identity. People don't just lose purchasing power when inflation strikes. They lose certainty, memory, and meaning. When prices change faster than thoughts, even time itself seems to collapse. Those who lived through it spoke later of a strange detachment, as if reality itself had become unstable. A week could feel like a year. A note printed today could become worthless before it dried. They described the air thick with the smell of ink and despair. And yet, somehow life continued. That is perhaps the most remarkable part of the story. Even when money died, people didn't. They adapted, endured, and rebuilt. The markets reopened. The trains ran again. Children went back to school. The world did not end. It simply learned, painfully, what happens when faith and value evaporates. Because money, at its core, is not metal or paper or even code. It is agreement, a shared fiction. The mark didn't die when the presses stopped. It died when people stopped believing in the story written on its face. And that's what makes this story eternal. If you've reached this point, ask yourself, how much of our own stability today still depends on belief alone? How many of our currencies, our markets, our promises would survive if confidence truly vanished? History whispers that no system is immune. Germany's lesson remains simple and brutal. Once trust is gone, there is no price high enough to buy it back. When money dies, what's left is not poverty, it's truth.